Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Richard Tiplady, and I'm one of the staff of the Scottish Episcopal Institute. I'd like to welcome you to the 2020 annual lecture of SEI. It's normally hosted by one of the ancient universities of Scotland, but today, for reasons that are all too familiar, we're being hosted by the not-so-ancient University of Zoom. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the lecture for around 10 or 15 minutes, and as the email that has come out to you has indicated, we would like all questions to be asked by the chat function. So please, at any time, if questions arise during the lecture, please post your questions in the chat on Zoom, and they will be moderated and passed to me to ask Cathy at the end. They can be asked during the lecture or during the Q&A session itself. But please just reserve the chat function for questions to allow the moderator to keep track of what's being asked. And so it's my great pleasure now to welcome Dr. Cathy Ross, who will lecture us on the topic of mission and formation in a time of lament and hope. Cathy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your warm welcome, Richard. Good to be with you all, even in a slightly different context. So, mission and formation in a time of lament and hope, reflections after COVID-19. So who would have thought that we'd still be here in this space, communicating and connecting online 6 months after our initial lockdown? Apparently, I did not think so when I gave Anne the title for this lecture back in early May, Mission and Formation in a Time of Lament and Hope, Reflections After COVID-19. Well, we're clearly not yet in the after, we're still in the midst of it with seemingly more to come. But of course, after can also mean influenced by, in the school of, so after Shakespeare, after Van Gogh. So I'm thinking we're still in the school of COVID and we still have much to learn in this school. However, we do believe that there will be an after, that this too will pass like other pandemics, and that we may be able to take learnings from this time into the after, which is still to come. So in this lecture, I'd like to take us on a journey from lament to hope, and then to reflect on what this might mean for mission and formation in our current context, and what we might take into the future after COVID. And I'm going to do this in two parts. The first part will be about 20 minutes, and we'll have a break. At the end of the first part, I've invited in a friend to come and share some of his learnings with us, Adam. And then we have another voice, Rachel, coming in the second part, so you don't just have to listen to me for the whole thing. So the first part will be about 20 minutes, 5-minute break to stretch, and then the second part will be about 15, hopefully 15 to 20, and then should be time for Q&A at the end. So let's get going. At the beginning of lockdown, like many of you, I suspect I was listening to podcasts, reading articles that came through on the pandemic, and going back to some old favourites. I listened again to a podcast by North American writer and chronicler Rebecca Solnit. She writes and speaks powerfully about hope. She finds grounds for hope in the altruism that she sees at work in the world, as well as in our responses to disaster, such as Hurricane Katrina, on which she was reflecting in this podcast. And so she says that thus a disaster is a lot like a revolution when it comes to disruption and improvisation. When it comes to disruption and improvisation, to new roles and to an unnerving or exhilarating sense that now anything is possible. As I read those words, it made me wonder. Disruption and improvisation, anything is possible. Can we even begin to think like that in the midst of such trauma and tragedy? And then I also read an article by Indian novelist Arundhati Roy, who considers the pandemic as a portal, a gateway between this world and the next. She urges us not to return to normality, but to reimagine our world anew, so we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Like Rebecca Solnit, she sees hope in the possibilities for newness and change, but that this will not come about automatically. We must be prepared to struggle for it. And then I also listened to a podcast by beloved Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, whose ideas on change resonate very much with those of Rebecca Solnit and Arundhati Roy. He advocates change by using the word disruption again. This is what he says. I think we think in terms of systems and continuities and predictability and schemes and plans. I think the Bible is to some great extent focused on God's capacity to break those schemes open and to violate those formulae. When they're positive disruptions, the Bible calls them miracles. We tend not to use that word when they're negative, but what it means is that the reality of our life and the reality of God are not contained in most of our explanatory schemes. I found that so challenging. When they're positive disruptions, we rejoice and we call them miracles, but when they're negative, we don't. I don't think that anyone would want to call COVID a miracle, but it is certainly a major disruption that has upset all our plans, called into question some of our most basic values and desires, unleashed unprecedented levels of certainty for those of us in the Western world, unleashed unprecedented levels of uncertainty for those of us in the Western world, and has challenged our whole way of life. It's also caused more than 1 million deaths and hardship and suffering for millions worldwide. So I think we can be clear that this is indeed a negative disruption. And perhaps the only appropriate response to that is to lament. I have found hope in being able to lament. I've discovered that the biblical language of lament helps us to name and face dark times or negative disruptions, and then to find hope. As we name and face our situation, mourn and grieve the current realities, sit with it and not rush on, then we can begin tentatively to find hope and new ways into the future after COVID. So some reading that has begun to open this up for me has been the work of two writers in particular, Roman Catholic Ugandan theologian Emmanuel Katongole and North American biblical scholar Kathleen O'Connor. Katongole's book, entitled Born from Lament, is a book that looks squarely at the truly terrible, evil and cruel violence and tragic suffering in Congo, which is where we have spent some of our earlier years as mission partners. And he reflects on how and why this has happened. He details the trauma and the depth of loss experience, the loss of community, the loss of humanity, the loss of an expected future. He asks, how does one live with this? Can there be a future? And if so, what kind? And where is God? He finds the clue to the future in the power and hope of lament. He reminds us that nearly 1/3 of the Psalms are Psalms of lament. Of course, there are Psalms of thanksgiving and royal Psalms, but the largest category are Psalms of lament, which means that the core of Israel's life, social, religious, and community, was framed by lament. A key component of lament is complaint. But maybe you think to complain is risky and might seem almost improper. I think it shows that the relationship with God is alive, dynamic, open. It also refuses to accept things the way they are. It protests God's silence and it presses God for deliverance. I think this requires courage to protest in this way against God, but we see it again and again in the Psalms and in the prophets such as Jeremiah. It may also be a way forward into newness. In the Psalms of Lament, while the writers draw on memories of God's saving actions in the past, there is always the risk and possibility that God will act in totally new ways as a result of this present suffering. So we may see and learn something totally new and unexpected about God and about our own situation. This is important for us to remember in our present context, that we may be learning new things about God and what may lie ahead for us in the future after COVID. Katongole says it's not those who lack faith who complain, but those recognised for strong faith, who bring their most honest and passionate feelings to God. It ensures that the relationship is alive, dynamic, negotiated, contested. It's also risky because complaint is a form of protest and pain. It refuses to accept the things the way they are, and it presses God for deliverance. It challenges God. How long, O God? Why do you hide your face? The first word of the Book of Lamentations is Ika, a cry of mourning, a kind of primordial and primeval cry to give voice to deep suffering. This ancient cry embodies a whole range of emotions: grief, despair, anguish, forgiveness, shame, hope, compassion. It's also a cathartic expression and an invitation to the audience not only to see and to experience the grief, but also to protest the pain. Interestingly, in the Book of Lamentations, the voice of God is silent and seemingly absent. There are 5 distinct voices heard throughout the book, but the one voice that is never heard is the voice of God. Kathleen O'Connor believes that God's silence is inspired, and she notes that God's silence in Lamentations leaves wounds festering, open to the air and possible to healing. The benefit of exposed wounds is that they become visible and unavoidable. Left exposed, they require us to see, acknowledge, and attend to them. Brueggemann has highlighted the absence of lament in our churches. He connects it with the inability to face suffering and to embrace negativity in our Western world. Glenn Pemberton, another scholar, suggests that the church as a middle-class institution has become increasingly embarrassed by the earthy and gritty language of lament. He writes, "We've chosen to live protected lives in insulated communities, whether our community is a middle to upper class neighbourhood or a church with a fortress mentality. Our lack of solidarity with those in need is what causes us to wonder why these prayers are even in the Bible and question who would ever need them." Lament sounds dreary and negative to those who do not wish to be reminded either of their own vulnerability and suffering or that of those around them. But lament allows us to articulate our pain. Voicing lament and pain can indeed be a form of resistance and a path to healing. It means that we will not be rendered powerless and voiceless. We will not remain paralyzed by despair. And as a form of resistance, lament can encourage agency. African American spirituals are a good example of this. The cry of anguish at the beginning of Lamentations is not only a way of naming and mourning what is lost, but is also a way of standing in the midst of the suffering. And so lament not only deepens our engagement with the world of suffering, but it also invites us into a more active social and political engagement. Lament is a form of complaint and resistance, and as we see in the Psalms and in Lamentations, it can turn to hope. However, the turn to hope is a struggle. Lament is a kind of discipline that involves multiple actions: crying out, remembering, keeping silent, repenting, and praying. It is a way of keeping hope alive amidst the despair. And intriguingly, the Psalms of Lament do show us a surprising turn to praise. However, it's important to note that lament and praise are not simply juxtaposed. Rather, there can be an unexpected movement which brings about a fresh perspective and new language. So this possibility of lament turning to praise reflects a transformation and innovation, a novelty that is only possible with the articulation of both pain and belief. Biblical lament has the potential to bring us to a new place, to a new depth, to a new song of praise, which is qualitatively different from the praise that has gone before. It's a new kind of depth of knowledge and experience, only made possible by the experience of the suffering and the pain. There are things that can be seen only with eyes that have cried, said a martyred Congolese archbishop. Grief keeps our hearts soft. North American psychotherapist Francis Weller tells us that grief is a gift. Our hearts are kept flexible, fluid, and open to the world through this closeness with loss. So it encourages a new kind of seeing, a kind of seeing emerging from the pain, the suffering, and anguish. And there are no shortcuts to this. This newness and hope emerge from the vulnerability, the suffering, the anguish. So we believe and trust that Lament has the possibility to bring us to a new place and to a new song, that there will be newness and hope, but it will be qualitatively different, and we will only arrive there because of the pain. Brueggemann encapsulates our current experience so accurately when he says, "The world we have trusted in is vanishing before our eyes, and the world that is coming at us feels like a threat to us. We can't quite see the shape of it." So what might this world that is coming to us mean for mission and formation in the light of COVID-19? And I hope that some of these reflections on lament and hope may help to move us forward into our world after COVID-19. So some thoughts now on mission and formation. If we think back to Solnit's challenge that disaster can bring disruption and improvisation, and to Arundhati Roy's plea to imagine another world, what might that mean for mission and formation? Well, some of you will know that I have been doing some work on John Taylor, on his missiology. John Taylor was a General Secretary of the Church Mission Society from 1963 to 74. He was a wordsmith, a photographer, a poet, and an exciting missiologist with some quite radical and innovative ideas. He's probably best known for his book, The Go-Between God, the Holy Spirit, and Christian Mission. And I did some research on him last year during my sabbatical, looking at his newsletters. He wrote a lot of newsletters during his time, about 140 of them during his time as General Secretary. And I was gifted his travel diaries by his daughter. So I was researching a lot of material that's been previously unpublished. And a colleague and I have published a book outlining some of this research. So John Taylor was the person who offered us the now succinct and popular summary of mission as seeing what God is doing in a situation and trying to do it with him, joining in with him. He rooted this in Christology and the Spirit, for Jesus had his eyes opened by the Spirit to recognize God at work in the world. As Jesus said to his disciples in John 5, "Very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise." As disciples, we are called to take the same position in relation to Jesus as Jesus had in his relation to the Father. So really, mission means joining in with God in the unfinished task of creation and redemption. So I'd like to frame this part of the lecture around some of Taylor's ideas for mission as a larger canvas for reflecting on how we could engage our imaginations in missiological formation and what these ideas might mean for how we participate in mission. And then I'll conclude with some ideas, again inspired by Taylor, for imagining another world that can bring us hope during and after a time of lament and after COVID. So this part is framed around Taylor's idea of mission as an adventure of the imagination. He challenges us to think of mission like this. And what might that do for our formation and our engagement in mission? Well, I think it means encouraging us to share the gospel with creativity and imagination. John Taylor originally used this phrase, an adventure of the imagination, in one of his early books, The Primal Vision. In that book, he's reflecting on the question of translation in relation to primal religions in Africa and how to use the imagination to make the gospel understandable in that context. Similarly, we desperately need the same gift of imagination in our postmodern and post-Christian Western contexts. He argues for more creativity, more imagination, and more gentle and nuanced cultivation as we engage with people. He says the evangelist, as Paul well knew, has to cultivate what grows from God's planting without trampling it with his own dogmatic boots. And may it not be that if we are ever to learn how to sing the Lord's song in the strange land of our secular world, we shall have to learn to use more of his obliquity. If we do not use the divine imagination given to us, we'll be embarrassed by a world capable of far more imagination than the church itself. What we need is not more technique, but more imagination. We need to cultivate our imaginations so that we can intrigue and surprise when we present the gospel, so that people are given an opportunity to discover for themselves what the cost of discipleship means and what gifts Jesus brings. This has led us at CMS in our Pioneer Mission Leadership Training to think about the air we breathe in our training environments. In other words, is it an air that encourages imagination, creativity, generative ideas, possibility and hope? Or are we more concerned with the right ways of doing things? We've found over the years books about art and art schools enlivening and full of good ideas for nurturing creative behaviours. This is one of the ones that we've found helpful, The Creative Stance, which summarises 7 behaviours that might help an artist to flourish. And there they are: imagination, provocation, risk, rigour, ambiguity, agency and resilience. One of the writers in that book is Grayson Perry, who encourages and promotes curiosity and exploration. And so in this book, he introduces a section on rigour, describing 2 internal characters, Hobbit and Punk. The one who does the hard work, the hard graft of learning the skill of making pots, glazes, and learning the craft. He says that students will not be good artists without that learning, without putting in the thousands of hours of work. But Hobbit can be a bit boring. So he also needs Punk, who can come along and mess with things creatively, play, break pots, rework them, contravene conventions and take risks. And it's the interplay between these 2 characters which leads to innovative practice. This is exactly what we need in our theology and in our training: a rigorous engagement with content and a creative angle to work that content. Actually, another thing Grayson Perry says, which we often say to our students, people say to Grayson Perry, how do you become a great artist if this, if somehow inspiration is going to fall from the sky? Grayson Perry says, be nice, work hard, turn up on time. I think that's quite good advice. So now to some imagining about mission, some imaginings. How about imagining mission as local? We think that mission is best done by the insiders or locals. The gospel's universal, but the gospel's thought forms, metaphors, and the way it's communicated will vary from place to place and age to age. Each age and context needs imagination to communicate the gospel afresh. This is best done by insiders. If the gospel is to be genuinely understood and lived out by a local culture and context, then the locals are the best ones to work this out. We need to be far more radical and creative in allowing this to happen. Too often we want to protect, to guard, to defend the gospel, thereby limiting its power and potential to embed and root itself in the local context. And then we're in danger of becoming the guardians of universality, mistrusting the local and the particular. We need not be afraid of the local. Instead, we need to allow the locals to mine their own culture and context for its riches, seams and veins that can begin to communicate the gospel afresh. The word is basic everywhere, but the thought forms, the metaphors, the logic in which it's communicated, these differ from culture to culture and age to age. So we work in the context of a mission society, which is absolutely fantastic and important for us because it exposes us to the global context. We've had our imagination sparked and enriched by learning from other contexts as well as the local. Students love reading theologies from other places, and we use a lovely book with students which talks about God from within an African worldview, a book called Theology Brewed in an African Book. It's a local theology, talking about God from within an African context, using imagery, parables, and stories from that context. It's creative, insightful, wonderfully African. To be able to think, dream, and talk about God in one's own language is vital. And I'm sure we're all well aware of the damage that's been done when historically much Western mission confused Western culture with gospel, and therefore not only undermined the goodness of the local culture, but also made the gospel seem like a foreign or exotic import into that context. Of course, it's exactly the same issue here in our own contexts. Often the way that faith is expressed here is foreign to many people outside the church, to many people in our world. So we need to be encouraged to seek to find ways to do theology and to communicate the gospel that relates to people's own communities, and to be encouraged to work out what theology might look like, brewed in the pot of their own local community. This requires imagination and improvisation, and ideally is something co-created together with the community and not something to be done on your own. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Adam to come and give an example of that from his context. Adam, you'll meet him in a moment. Adam's a great guy, and he founded something called Revs Limited. He will tell you about that in a moment. And he was awarded Lockdown Initiative 2020 by Historic Motoring for his initiative. So over to you, Adam.
Good evening, everybody. So I started a group called Revs, which was an outreach, if you like, to the classic car community. Cathy talked about being local. Well, I'm local to it in that I was a car designer and worked in the auto industry right up until 2011 when I started my ordination training. But I always felt that those people that I'd worked with, those people who shared that passion for cars that I had, still needed to know of God's love for them, and Revs is really the result. And one of the things that we've been grappling with at Revs is this very issue of language, of imagination, of metaphor, and particularly when it comes to perhaps talking to people about issues of God's restoring work in their lives, of the issue of even sin. And we've begun to explore what that might look like in that particular context. So we don't talk about sin, we talk about rust, how rust damages the structure of a car, how it stops it being all that it was created to be, how often it takes a radical work to restore a car right to its very nature in order that that car then becomes all that it was intended to be, all that it was designed to be. And you can begin to then kind of talk about rust in cars and how perhaps our own selfishness, our own struggles are like the rust that attacks the very nature of who we are. And we also talk a lot about restoration and how restoring a car is often done at great cost over a long period of time. But one day the hope and the thing that the owner looks forward to is when that car is wheeled out and it is made new again in the light of all the work that's been done on it. And that's a great kind of metaphor for talking about God's saving work, God's restoring work in our lives, how it's done at great cost, how sometimes it takes time to understand and to accept that restoring work in our lives, and yet that future hope. So we kind of wrestle with the theology and we reinterpret it in the light of the context we're in. I liken it to being, if you like, bilingual, speaking two different languages. The language that we will all be familiar with theology and with our faith, and then the language of my local context, this classic car culture. Revs has been running as a bishop's mission-ordered sponsored project from the Diocese of Lichfield here for now just over a year formally, although we've been doing stuff really in the last 3 or 4 years. But it's very much based around this idea of being local, of getting creative and using our imagination to talk about the things of God, but very much in a way that a whole non-church generation of people who just happen to love cars will be able to contend with. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. I think that's an absolutely fantastic example of imagination, creativity, and trying to communicate appropriately for a particular local context. So The next imagining I'd like us to think about is imagining mission as prophetic. Mission needs to be able to discern the signs of the times and be alert to the winds of the Spirit. In other words, it needs to be prophetic. John Taylor outlines what is needed to become a prophet, and he says 3 things: sight, sign, and solidarity. We need the gift of sight because the prophetic impulse begins with a seeing eye, literally a seer. In terms of sign, we need to recapture the ability to be signs of God's kingdom in ways that communicate and pique interest, rather than spell out the meaning in a literal, dreary, or dogmatic way. His third and most challenging concept is solidarity. For in order to be a sign of the gospel, we have to walk the sacrificial way of solidarity with the people and the situation concerning which we've been given a gift of insight and a word to proclaim. So an excellent example of engaging in mission in this prophetic space is Clean for Good. A few years ago, a parish in London noted a surprising number of low-paid cleaners working in unjust circumstances. So they decided to set up a cleaning company to provide work for cleaners with decent working conditions and paying the London living wage. Their website tells us Clean for Good enables cleaners to thrive, not just survive. Every cleaner is viewed and treated as a person with skills and potential. We want to promote the idea that cleaning is a respected and dignified career. We care about our employees and want to enable them with the skills and confidence to progress not only within our company, but in their life. What about imagining mission as costing everything? Mission will mean conversion, and conversion is a turning, a radical reorientation of a person towards God, a changed relationship through repentance and faith in Christ. We need to face some difficult questions as to what conversion means and how it works in cultures with little or no Christian heritage, and to be realistic about the challenge that this presents. Taylor asked the question, but is that kind of repentance and faith immediately possible to a person whose ideas and attitudes are completely untouched by what we might call the presuppositions of the Bible? Words such as sin, even life and death, may mean something completely different or nothing at all. We've heard Adam using the word rust instead of sin, trying to make that more contemporary and appropriate for his context. The culmination of evangelism is conversion, but it seems sometimes that God might be more patient with people than we are, and that God's ways of eliciting a response may be more varied and unexpected than any of ours. The rich young ruler, for example, had to abandon his privilege as a condition of discipleship, and his coming to Christ had social as well as spiritual implications. There are no universal rules. Each situation has to be measured and judged afresh. Taylor says, so the heart of the problem seems to be to distinguish between the stone of stumbling Christ lays before those who approach him as an inescapable demand, and the stumbling blocks which we create unnecessarily while calling them basic. So this does require much discernment and wisdom and is a harder road to follow. Imagining mission as dangerous. Our practice of mission, obviously, is undergirded by our theology. What if our theology were not safe? Taylor believes there's no such thing as safe theology, because a theology that's in touch with the world will be a living theology with all its attendant risks, mistakes, and developments. Theology has a missionary role in its task to communicate the truths of the gospel to a world that is constantly changing. Therefore, theology must emerge out of a dynamic encounter with the world. A theology of mission that is grounded and rooted in current realities must be interdisciplinary and ask searching and challenging questions. Nearly 50 years ago, back in the 70s, Canon Theologian John Mbiti asserted that we're charismatically universal, but theologically provincial. In other words, we believe and proclaim a universal gospel, but we allow our theology to remain limited and constrained by our own provincial horizons. Hard questions arise and face us as we engage in mission. Taylor gives the example of a young Anglican monk in a Buddhist context, where he includes reading from a Buddhist text in the preparatory part of the communion service. Taylor muses, Is this truth or compromise? Such are the hard questions that face us there and everywhere as we struggle to communicate the gospel appropriately and in context. It's a serious undertaking. It's a long undertaking with no certain outcome. We need to experiment, we'll make mistakes, but it's absolutely necessary if we're to develop a missional theology that is fit for purpose. All theology which is earnest is also dangerous. It's an act of adoration fraught with the risk of blasphemy. That is why mission can be dangerous. And then just the last point here before going on to the final section, imagining mission as sharing the gospel in all humility and gentleness. This is a real issue for the Church of England as an established church. Evangelism as a practice of mission must be practiced with all humility and gentleness. In one of his newsletters, John Taylor reflected on Christian witness in China, and he sharply criticised the use of power and wealth in evangelism. He wrote, the use of superior power to commend the gospel, whether the power of money or the power of expertise or the power of access to political authority, even though it's used to do good and to serve the needy unconditionally, may result in conversions, but many of them will be conversions to the more successful way of life, not conversions to Jesus Christ. And he believed that when the reaction sets into this approach, then it may also mean a rejection of Jesus, whose name is associated with this method. He makes a plea that we power-conscious Westerners learn the secret of Paul's method, who wrote, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I came to you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. He implored us to open our minds and to see things in this context from the Chinese point of view. And so to prepare ourselves for a creative interchange with the Chinese people when that opportunity presents itself. He reminded us that our most telling form of witness to the Lord's power will not be the things that we can say to China, but our readiness to listen to what China, to what the classic car context, to what the housing estate, to what China is saying to us. And this remains a continuing challenge in each of our contexts, as we need to listen to what each of those contexts is saying to us and what gifts they may bring us. And now, just to have another little illustration, I'd like to invite Rachel Summers, who's going to tell us something about trees. Rachel was lockdown tree champion for London over lockdown. So I shall stop sharing, and Rachel, over to you.
Hi, so yeah, I'm one of the lockdown tree champions for London, but I do have a shiny certificate, so that was very exciting. It came in the post yesterday. So I live in Walthamstow, which is in East London, and I'm a forest school teacher, which means that I work outdoors all year round, through the seasons, through the weather, with schools and with families and with nurseries, to help them explore and to grow their sense of connection with their local wild urban spaces. In reality, it basically means I get paid to make mud pies and toast marshmallows, so it's quite a good job. But over lockdown, when we weren't really able to travel far from our homes, I was really missing my woods, because you can imagine being there day in, day out. You get this kind of connection with a place, and being surrounded by trees was my normal, and suddenly it was taken away from me. But then while I was doing my daily walk around the streets near my home, I became aware that actually I did have trees all around me, and I'd never really noticed or appreciated them before. I just walked past them. And I thought that maybe I wasn't the only person who was feeling trapped and missing nature. So the next time I went out for my daily walk, I took a piece of chalk with me, and I started to label the names of the trees on the pavement as I passed them, kneeling down there in the dirt and scribing down what the trees were called. And I'm not exactly a tree expert. I know a few trees. It's quite interesting, kind of as time went on, I was kind of learning to differentiate between the different ones and find out more about them. And I had this really strong sense that by doing these kind of simple chalk labels, I'd be able to present this prison of our streets that it felt for me and for other people, I think, as a gift something to be loved and cherished, so that as people read these chalk labels, they'd be encouraged to look up and to look out, and that's mission, isn't it, really? And for me, noticing is often prayer. And when I was doing this, it felt very much like I was doing theology, but with trees as my sacred text, if that makes sense. I was trying to hear what they, as part of God's creation, had to speak to us in our particular situation of lockdown. And I was kind of find out a bit about the trees, get to know a bit about kind of their personality, if you like, and find something that really leapt out to me from that about maybe what I felt God was trying to speak to us. So, for example, Turkish hazel is a really common street tree around here. So I scribed up Turkish hazel tolerates difficult conditions, or silver birch looks fragile, but it's actually extremely tough. Lots of lime trees. In France, a lime tree is a symbol of liberty. And in Finland, it represents protection. And lots about London planes. Obviously, we're in London. They're everywhere. One of my favourite trees, partly because London plane creates beauty out of pollution. That was something I remember writing. And also, London plane can put up with anything. They're really resilient trees. And ash trees, the wood absorbs shocks without splintering. So these things, they are facts about the trees, basic facts about the trees, but actually they mean something on more than one level. And I think that this really resonated with people who were reading the labels, and not just the local people around my local street who were reading the labels I'd literally written in chalk outside their front doors, but also it ended up being thousands of people following them online all around the world. And it was something that really resonated at the time. And I found it really exciting to see how something that was so local and so simple, I mean, it's really low tech, isn't it, compared to all the kind of high tech Zoom and computer stuff going on at the time. It's just one crazy woman and her piece of chalk, and sometimes a dog, and sometimes a rained on small boy. But it was able to speak to people and speak with a message that they needed to hear. And the first time I went out with my chalk, I was kind of hoping that somebody might notice what I'd done, and I'd kind of get to hear gossip about it, maybe from people I knew or people in the local community. What I wasn't expecting was for someone to post that very first chalking I did on Twitter, where it ended up with 125,000 likes and being retweeted 20,000 times. And it got big really fast, and it kind of felt like it was my lockdown job. Almost every day I'd go out with my chalk and I'd be kind of going out and finding the trees and reflecting back on what I felt they had to say to us, into our experience. And it was a complete joy to see how this kind of tree loving grew and grew. So it wasn't just me doing it, people started doing it in different cities around England and then around the world, and how it gave people this joy and strength and hope at such a difficult time.
Thanks, Rachel. I think that's a really great example again of creativity and imagination, and sharing the gospel in all humility and gentleness. So let me just share my screen again, and there's some of Rachel's chalk writings, and we'll just go on to the last section, which I'll whiz through, about imagining another world as possible after COVID. So here again, I'm drawing on some pithy sayings and inspiration from John Taylor to inform our current context. And here's the first one. A good place to start is with whoever is at home. So we've been trying to think about the current context and use that as an opportunity for reflection and responses. And this is how my colleague Johnny Baker, who's here tonight, I think, and by the way, these wonderful photos are his photos, so thank you, Johnny. This is how Johnny responded to the rule of 6, which we have in England, where you can only meet with 6 people inside or outside, depending on which tier you're in. So Johnny wrote, taking church as an example, how can church work, grow and be if limited to homes and groups of 6? When you stop and think about it, there have been loads of times and places where the church has only been able to meet in homes and has flourished. I think I'd go so far as to say that perhaps the household is the most natural habitat for communities of disciples. With financial challenges already present and looming for the foreseeable future, We're learning to cherish the weakness of limited means. We're learning to cherish weakness and vulnerability, uncertainty, and our inability to fix things. Unsurprisingly, we're finding that this puts us in line with most of the rest of the world. And we're trying to use our imaginations instead of relying on assumed and former ways of doing things. I think we've all learned that enough is enough and that we need to develop a theology of enough. We're learning that we need to respect the planet and not to be so consumerist and extravagant. In 1972, nearly 50 years ago, John Taylor wrote, "Our Western way of life is marked by excess, and whichever aspect of our situation one looks at, our consumption of food, our accumulation of goods, our wage claims and price rises, our waste and pollution, the concentration and congestion of our cities, our destruction of living creatures, our plunder of fuels and minerals, our expenditure on armaments, and the wanton disproportion of the way we use them. Excess is the word that comes continually to mind. Ruthless, unbridled, unthinking excess." Perhaps we are learning to respect the planet, to live more simply so that others may simply live, and to take delight and joy in simple pleasures. We're learning that the missionary frontier is on our doorstep, literally. Many of us have got to know our neighbours in new ways, and this has been a joy and delight and a surprise for many. A good place to start is with whoever's at home, and we've quite literally been forced to start here, as around the whole of the UK, we're stuck at home with various restrictions. We've learned to be more humble, to listen more to others and to our own bodies, as our generation has never encountered anything like this before. This is a new experience for all of us, and we've had to learn again. We've been forced to come as a stranger with everything to learn again, as all this is such uncharted territory for us. We've learned that the world is the church's milieu, again quite literally, as we've been forced out of our old ways of doing things. Perhaps church is not the point of church, and the pandemic has forced us to be in the world, both physically where we can, as well as online. Taylor says, "Leap over the wall or perish," and we agree that we need to leap over walls that we have created to be in the world. We've learned to look to the fringes because that's where new things start and where Jesus was. It's no different now. Surprising things emerge on the edges. Johnny Baker writes, "The church is most surely herself when she's at the periphery with those who are fringe dwellers." Jesus was loved by outsiders, fringe dwellers. If the church wants to be renewed, she should do likewise and look to the fringes rather than the centre. We've been learning to get off our high horse and muck in. There have been wonderful stories of the community mucking in during this time. This resonates with Rebecca Solnitz's comments on altruism and disaster response. George Monbiot reminded us at the beginning of the pandemic how it's catalysed community action on a vast scale. All over the world, people are being kind, gentle, helpful, courageous, creative, getting off their high horse and mucking in. We're learning the art of being a minority. We need to let go of any expectations of status and power and learn how to practice the art of being a minority, being on the margins and on the edge. Richard Rohr writes about the edge of the inside, and he encourages this posture. He says, "When you live on the edge and of anything with respect and honour, you're in a very auspicious and advantageous position. You are free of its central seductions, but also free to hear its core message in new and creative ways." Dutch missiologist Stefan Paas, in his book Pilgrims and Priests, believes that the minority posture is the natural position for Christians in the West, especially as we learn what it means to live as a Christian on other people's terms. Lament and hope has given us the opportunity to offer the song note of joyous witness. Surely we, of all people, can offer presence and hope for those suffering in these days. As we are present alongside others in all our own vulnerability and pain, we can at least point to healing and wholeness, as well as a future hope. And finally, I think we are learning the long trek into the terra incognita of Christ. We're learning to live one day at a time, which is perhaps far more difficult than we'd ever imagined. We are learning that life indeed is a terra incognita and that we are not in control. Much as Jesus' teaching about the kingdom is on exactly this, not only about its hiddenness and its veiledness, but also about its unpredictability and the sheer length of time discovering it can take. Indeed, the journey into the terra incognita of Christ can be a long journey. It can be a journey of disruption and improvisation. It can be a journey of lament and hope, and a journey to another world after COVID. Thank you.
Cathy, thank you so much. There, as you see the chat, you will see that there are quite a number of questions, and I will endeavour to get through as many as I can in the time remaining. I want to begin. I noted one of your last slides said we need to cherish the weakness of limited means. And in a blog recently, you said that one of CMS's founding principles is to put money in second place. And there were two questions that I think are related, so I'll try and summarise both and then ask you to comment on them. So the first question was, how much wiggle room do we have in a church framework to contextualise, and to what extent will our preoccupation with finances affect us? And then a related question was, how do we go about the reimagining? What tools, specific tools, might help us in the reimagining, or will we be engulfed by the elephant in the room, which is survival and finances? Mm-hmm. So could you reflect back a little more on that? You've talked a little there, obviously, about that, but I think there's clearly in the time of COVID and worries about offerings and church income, I think you touched on something important. So the how question, I think, perhaps is behind those questions.
Yeah, great questions, and I'm not sure if I have any slick or clever answers. I love that CMS founding principle, these 5 founding principles of CMS, and one of them is put money in second place. Of course, maybe that's easy to say when we have money and we have a certain amount of security, but I think lack of finances forces us, or cherishing the weakness of limited means, forces us to rely on God, forces us to trust, and I think does force us or enable us to practice creativity and imagination. And that's something that my colleague Johnny Baker, who's here, who probably would be far better to speak on this, has really encouraged us a lot on, to think about creativity and there's various exercises, in fact, that you can do. And in fact, in the book that Johnny and I have written on Imagining Mission with John Taylor, each chapter, at the end of each chapter, there are some creative exercises that Johnny's written, drawing on his experience over the years. So I think practicing creativity is really important as we try to engage in mission. But how much wiggle room do we have? Do we end up being preoccupied with finances? Well, I think that's why you don't want to be at the centre. Because the centre can worry about those things. We call it the institutional hairball. I guess someone has to do it, but we think you just get away with a lot more when you're on the margins and on the edges and on the fringes, and it seems to us that that's where Jesus was. I'm not sure if that is a very coherent answer, but those are some of the things that we talk about and think about.
Yeah, thank you. There's a sort of slight follow-up question that perhaps to just take this a little bit further, the same question, but perhaps your own experience in world Christianity may also perhaps relate to this. So one of the questions was, in our comfortable churches in the West, is it always Easter Sunday rather than Holy Saturday? And what can we learn from world Christianity in this question? That it's a sort of follow-up to the same topic, really. So from your experience of your connections around the world, your knowledge of world Christianity, what do you think we can learn?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I remember hearing from a friend, actually a South African friend, who said to me that in the apartheid years, the church services that were the most attended, had the highest number of attendees, were Easter Saturday services. Whereas we just go from, Good Friday to Easter Sunday, or Jesus' birth and his resurrection, and forget about everything in between. And I think part of the point of newness that we have found with our pioneers, and that certainly is the experience of Christians in the majority world, is there's no way to newness without suffering. So we just don't expect that in the West, because we don't want to face our mortality. We are used to comfort. And I think this is why this is such a shock for us, the whole COVID context, because suddenly we're in the limelight, we're on the spotlight, And we are suffering, although very minimally in Western countries with all the kind of safety nets that we have. But there is no way to newness without suffering and vulnerability. And that's what Lament shows us. The only way to hope is through lament and suffering. And that's why people like Emmanuel Katongole, these Ugandan and majority world theologians, are great to read, because they've lived that, they've experienced it, and that comes out of their experience. There are things that can be seen only with eyes that have cried. Such a great quotation. Or if you want to look up, if you get a chance, look up an amazing Burundian woman called Maggie Barankitse, who was involved in the genocide in Rwanda, and then set up this amazing thing called Maison Shalom, which are communities of healing for children. But she said, one of her phrases, which I absolutely find very inspiring, is love made me an inventor. She was not going to be overcome by the absolute appalling genocide in Burundi. Love made her an inventor. It was out of the suffering and out of love that drove her innovation.
Thank you. Thank you. Our time has gone. Thank you for the other questions. I'm sorry we don't have time to take them, but I do want to honour the time commitment, which is to keep this to an hour. And so I'd now like to hand over to Canon Anne Tomlinson, the Principal of the Scottish Episcopal Institute, for a vote of thanks.
On behalf of the 125 or so people watching this SEI lecture tonight online, I want to say a huge thank you to you, Cathy, and to you, Rachel, and to Adam, for all you've set before us this afternoon. Your joint presentation has been immensely creative, imaginative, provocative, and rigorous, instantiating so many of those behaviours that you talked about early on in your lecture and urged us to adopt likewise. I think you've helped us to turn our COVID-induced sadness into praise and renewed energy for mission, to fire us to leap over whatever walls we've allowed to constrain us, and to gird up our loins to enter that terra periculosa as pioneers and as humble learners, and to leap lightly over those walls with little baggage into God's amazing, diverse world, which, as John Taylor said, is the church's milieu. You've reminded us that another world is indeed possible, and for that act of what I can only call revolutionary disruption, we thank you. So as you have inspired our imaginations that go-between spark of the Holy Spirit, I'm going to have to ask you now to use your imagination as you envisage 125 people or so expressing their exuberant and grateful thanks to you now at home. Thank you deeply from us all.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you everyone for your attention.